Today, the offshore search for hydrocarbons takes us into water depths only dreamed of a few years ago. Now we drill for oil and gas in thousands of feet or meters of water, as deep as 10,000 feet or 3,000 meters in some cases. We drill from floating offshore drilling rigs, like this drill ship, out where the water is deep. It takes a floating rig to communicate between the water's surface and the wellhead on the deep ocean floor. On floaters, the drilling crew runs riser joints like this. Risers connect the drilling vessel with the wellhead on the seafloor. Using riser pipe, crew members lower the subsea blowout preventer stack to the wellhead. The riser joints are a conduit between the subsea BOP stack and the surface. We lower the bit and drill stem to bottom through the riser, and the riser carries drilling fluid and cuttings back to the rig on the surface. In effect, the riser extends the borehole from the ocean floor to the surface. When drilling in deep water, the rig crew first runs several regular riser joints, slick joints like this. The slick joints allow a powder placement and lock between the BOP stack and the wellhead. Then they run riser joints with buoyant modules attached to them. Why run buoyant riser joints? Well, as you know from handling riser joints, they're heavy. In fact, they're so heavy that if we ran nothing but slick risers in deep water drilling, even the normal heavy-duty riser tensioning equipment couldn't handle them. So, we used buoyant risers. The special material that surrounds the riser joints makes them buoyant. This buoyancy helps support the weight of the riser string and relieves stresses on the tensioning equipment. It's not hard to prepare, handle, and run buoyant risers, but you have to take the time to do it right. In this program, we'll show you how to do it both in the yard and on the rig. Teamwork is the key to properly installing and handling buoyant risers. Everyone in the company is part of a team that has to pull together. Knowing about the work everyone does gives us a better appreciation for not only their job, but for yours too. So let's begin in the yard with the tasks a crew does to assemble buoyant riser joints before sending them to the dock or offshore rig. This is a buoyant material called syntactic foam. Technically, syntactic foam is a thermoset resin with reinforced micro and macrospheres. Simply put, it's a hard plastic foam full of small air bubbles, the spheres. The spheres give it buoyancy. Each sphere has a hard shell to keep it from breaking under pressure. Each buoyant attachment has a glass reinforced finish. This makes it pretty tough, but it's not like concrete or steel. You can damage it if you're not careful. The buoyant attachments are supplied in two parts, a top and a bottom. The two make up a flotation module. You install one half on each side of the riser joint. This particular riser joint takes 5 complete modules, 10 halves, to cover it. Others may require more or fewer modules, depending on riser length. Manufacturers design flotation modules for use at specific depths. They're color-coded according to depth of use. Manufacturers publish charts of color versus depth rating. Here, the identification color is at left, and the depth rating in meters and feet is at right. For example, rigs use modules with a green color code in waters no deeper than 607 meters or 2,000 feet. Note the other colors and corresponding depths. You don't have to remember what depths the colors indicate, but you do have to remember not to mix colors. That is, all the color codes on the modules must match when you install them on a riser joint. All green, all blue, all orange, all black. Whatever color, they must be the same color on a particular riser joint. Now let's look at all the things people in the yard have to do to handle modules and assemble them on a riser joint. We'll cover proper stacking, assembling modules on a riser joint, and loading a dressed riser on a truck. Proper handling begins when stacking the modules in the yard. Here, they're moving the modules with a forklift. Ideally, the forks should be 6 feet or 2 meters apart. The idea is to support the modules so they won't bend in the middle or on the ends too much. Avoid stressing the modules so you won't break or crack them. Here's a cracked module. Mishandling cracked it. Avoid this by taking the time to properly handle and stack the modules in the yard. Start by placing wooden timbers or battens on the ground and between each row of modules. Depending on the length of the module, you may need 2 battens, or you may need 3. Shorter modules require only 2, longer ones 3. 1 timber at each end and 1 in the middle. Ample support keeps the heavy modules from cracking or breaking, and don't stack them more than 4 rows high. Stacking them higher puts too much weight on the bottom row, and they could crack. With the modules properly stacked, let's cover installing them on a riser. The first step is a pre-job meeting to plan the job. They review the manufacturer's specifications for the job and discuss each person's specific task. They note hazards to look out for and special factors that may affect each task. Next, they inspect the modules that they'll assemble on the riser. They look for significant damage like this crack. This module is not usable. Take it out of service for repair or replacement. On the other hand, some damage is only minor, like this dent caused by a rock when the module contacted the ground. If you find damage and don't know whether it's significant, point it out to your supervisor. With the modules inspected, let's look at a couple of ways to get them onto the slick riser. Here they're using a forklift to place the bottom module halves onto battens. They take care not to jab the forks into the module. Notice that they placed timber battens directly under the bolt pockets on the modules. The bolt pockets hold the bolts that attach these particular modules to the riser joint. With battens placed this way, the bottom half of the modules get plenty of support. They're now ready to take the riser joint. They'll use a crane to pick up the riser joint and place it in the bottom half of the modules. While the crane's moving into position, let's watch the yard crew get the riser joint ready. First, they make sure there's a properly installed thrust collar at each end of the riser joint. The thrust collar holds the top and the bottom buoyancy modules in position. Next, they attach a riser lifting plug onto each end of the riser joint. Here's where they'll attach the shackles and slings to the riser for the crane lift. They also tie a tagline onto each end of the riser joint. Don't overlook using taglines. They help control the load. And speaking of taglines, take a good look at them before you use them. A worn tagline won't do you any good if it breaks during the lift. Tape the ends to keep them from unraveling. With the lifting plugs installed and the taglines on, the crew attaches the crane slings with shackles. The crane operator picks up the riser joint, and the yard crew guides it to the bottom halves of the buoyancy modules. Note how they stand clear of the load while it's being lifted, and use those taglines. With the riser nested in the bottom half of the modules, they're almost ready to install the top halves. But first, they lubricate these rubber grommets with petroleum jelly, Vaseline. They're part of the spacers that support the riser boost line and rigid conduit that run along the riser pipe. The line runs to the subsea blowout preventers the riser connects with on the seafloor. The Vaseline helps the upper modules slip easily onto the spacers. They may have to flip a module half to get it ready to go on top of the riser. To do it right, they use a soft sling and the forklift. Never use a wire rope or a chain to turn over a module. They could damage it. They use the forklift and a special scissors device to pick up and move the upper module to the riser joint. Notice how the module half is balanced in the lift. It's not tipping up or down too much. And they're being careful not to damage the module. Modules are heavy and tough, but they're not steel or concrete. Notice the space or gap between the modules. This particular brand of module requires a gap to keep the modules from being crushed together when the riser joint flexes. But this brand of module does not require a gap. In fact, this brand has adjusting bolts on the end of the riser that a person tightens to eliminate any gap between the modules. So, the crew uses the manufacturer's assembly drawing that comes with each riser order to see if they need a gap between the modules. If they do, the drawing shows what the gap's dimension should be. And if a gap is needed, they use a tape to measure each gap. They make sure they're the right distance apart according to the specifications on the drawing. Using battens under the bottom modules is a good way to support them before lowering the riser joint, but it's not the only way. For example, this yard has a special cradle. It allows them to put on the upper modules and then use a forklift to place the lower ones. Also, if the yard has a module holding device like this one, they can install the upper and lower modules together. Regardless of how they install the modules, the next step is to properly secure them to the riser joint. The crew uses one of three kinds of attachment hardware. One type has a stainless steel bolt with stainless steel plates, washers, and nuts on each end. Another has a long Kevlar strap with a stainless steel bolted buckle that goes on the outside of the modules. Kevlar is a very strong but lightweight material. The last type consists of a short Kevlar strap that goes inside an opening in the module. A stainless steel U-bolt secures the strap. We'll cover all three types. No matter which type of attachment hardware is used, the crew carefully inspects it before installing it. Here you can see why. These bolts, nuts, and plates are corroded. Replace them with new hardware that meets manufacturer specifications. The same holds true of Kevlar straps. Immediately reject a damaged one and replace it with one recommended by the manufacturer. If in doubt about whether to replace hardware or straps, check with your supervisor. To install these modules, they're using a single bolt type of attachment. The bolt goes through the stainless steel plates and bolt pockets on each module. They attach nuts on each end. Each module requires several bolts. They use thread lubricant on the bolts. They're careful not to cross-thread and force a nut onto the bolt, which could gall it and ruin it. Once threaded hand tight, they tighten the nut to specifications with a torque wrench. In this case, it's 25 foot-pounds or 34 newton meters. But check the specifications with the order. The main thing is not to over-tighten the nuts. Over-tightening can damage the module, the bolt, or both. So use of a torque wrench is imperative. And if required, add the locking nut too. It ensures the main nut will stay tight. However, instead of a locking nut, some rig owners like to use a stainless steel nut with a nylon insert to keep it tight. This type of nut is used. Don't use one like this. It's already been threaded onto a bolt, and the nylon is shredded. It won't work. With nylon nuts, always use new ones that meet manufacturer's specifications. And if you drop a bolt in the dirt, clean it before using it. But use a non-metallic fiber or stainless steel brush to clean it. A regular carbon steel brush leaves behind small metallic particles that can corrode stainless steel. Use a lubricant on the threads, but beware. Do not use a copper-based lubricant or any thread dope with metal in it. Why? Well, the hardware is made of stainless steel. Use copper-based lubricant on stainless steel, and here's the result. Corrosion. Metal eaten away. A copper-based dope creates a corrosion cell. It's like electrolysis. The copper takes the steel away, leaving corroded places. This crew is attaching the modules with a long Kevlar strap that goes on the outside of the modules. Notice that the straps are in good shape and not twisted. The stainless steel hardware is not corroded, and they use non-metallic thread dope. They're careful not to cross-thread the nuts. Finally, they use the recommended torque on the nuts, usually 25 to 35 foot-pounds. Here's the short Kevlar strap that goes inside each module at several points. This system has U-bolts to secure the internal straps. The crew checks to ensure the hardware is not corroded and that the Kevlar is in good shape. They use non-metallic thread dope and are careful not to force the nut onto the U-bolt threads. They torque to the specified amount and use locking nuts if required. After assembling the modules to the riser joint, crew members give the whole assembly one more check for damage. Remember that although the foam is heavy and fairly hard, it's not steel or concrete. You can damage it. Report damage to your supervisor. You may have to remove and replace bad modules. Once the modules are assembled on the riser, this crew uses a crane to pick up the dressed riser and stack it for storage prior to being sent to the rig. They use the correct lifting plugs, shackles, and slings. And tag lines control the load. You can place the first row of dressed risers on a cradle like this. Notice the supports that go under the modules at or near the bolt pockets. This is good because it gives the riser plenty of support to prevent damage. If you don't have a cradle, you can place the dress joint onto a clean, hard, and flat surface. Notice the timber battens placed at regular intervals to properly support the joint. This dress joint is ready to load on a truck. Since riser joints are long, the truck's flatbed trailer must be long enough to support the joint along its entire length. Otherwise, movement on the road could damage the joint as it flexes. So, the crew determines the required length and extends the bed. Then, they install a center section in the bed to support the riser. With particularly long riser joints, they may also have to install an extension on the trailer. To repeat, it's important to support the dressed riser over its entire length. A bed too short could lead to cracked modules, something we definitely want to avoid. With the truck ready, crew members attach a lifting plug to each end of the riser. Then they rig the plug to the forklift. Slowly and carefully, the forklift operators move the dressed joint onto the bed of the truck. With the dressed joint in place, the crew straps it to the trailer. Notice that they use a strap at each bolt pocket along the riser length for good support. Also note that the straps are made of strong synthetic fiber and are wide. What's wrong with this picture? Well, the riser joint is hanging, unsupported, off the end of the truck. It could be damaged in transit. Avoid this by installing an extension on the trailer. Crew members can use a crane to load the riser on a truck. With a crane, they use tag lines to guide the riser to the bed of the truck, and they stay out from under the load. This dressed riser joint, properly loaded on the truck, is off to the boat dock for its trip to the offshore rig. Once at the boat dock, it's important to move the dressed joints properly Here, two forklifts move the joint with lifting plugs attaching the joints to the lifts. Properly rig up riser joints for lifts and moves in different ways. For example, here the crew attach the shackles and sling to the riser joint's flange. And here the crew uses a special collar with a sling attachment point. When lifting riser joints, the main thing to remember is do not attach the slings where they could damage the thrust collars and the control lines that run alongside the riser. This is not the way to do it. Before rigging up the riser to the crane at the boat dock, crew members inspect it to ensure it hasn't been damaged in transit. Meanwhile, the boat backs up to the dock, ready to take on the dressed riser joint. Here, the crew uses an overhead bridge crane to move the joint to the boat deck. Using tag lines, they guide the joint to the deck, staying clear of the load. With the joint on the deck, the next step is to secure it. Note the soft slings between the chains and the syntactic foam for protection. But this crew secured the dressed risers to the boat deck with unprotected chains, a definite no-no. The naked chain could easily gouge the foam as the boat pitches and heaves on the open sea. Just to reinforce the message, here's the right way to secure a dressed riser. Soft slings protect the foam from the chains. In this section, we'll cover handling buoyant riser joints on the rig. We'll look at inspecting, running, and pulling risers. Once the dressed riser joints arrive at the rig, crew members need to continue proper care and handling procedures. Here, the buoyant riser joints are properly stacked on board the rig. Note that the joints are stacked according to color coding on the modules. These are ready to run, but before running them, all crew members involved on the job hold a pre-job meeting. This way, everyone becomes familiar with what the job entails, knows what their duties are aware of the hazards, and are familiar with special considerations. After the meeting breaks up, the first step is to inspect the modules for damage. Notify your supervisor if you find a damaged module. Meanwhile, the crew positions the subsea stack in the moon pool. With the stack ready, the floor crew picks up the first riser joint and lowers it to the top of the stack. Note that the first riser joints are slick. That is, no buoyant modules are on the first joints. Full riser weight at first ensures a firm connection to the BOP stack. Once the first joint's connected to the stack's lower marine riser package, they lower the stack into the water. Usually, the crew runs several slick joints. While running or pulling riser joints, do not walk under the riser. It's just common sense not to walk under a heavy load being moved on the rig. Should the load fall and hit you, injury or death could occur. After the required number of slick riser joints are run, the crew starts running the buoyant risers in the correct order, according to the color code. Here, the first buoyant modules to go in are coded black. They're rated for 6,000 feet, 1,800 meters of water. A crew member should check the modules as the driller lowers them. Look for damage and loose connecting nuts. If you find a loose one, tighten it. When the driller lowers the next joint to the floor level, crew members remove the protectors on the end of the joint. They carefully stab the joints. Using a special wrench, they tighten the connecting bolts to proper torque. Finally, the joints lowered. On into the night, crew members run buoyant riser joints. Eventually, the stack will reach the wellhead on the sea floor. Once the stack is set, then the rig and crew can begin drilling. Eventually, the hole will reach final depth and it'll be time to finish the well. After the crew pulls the drill stem, they'll unlatch from the wellhead and begin pulling riser joints. Here's some points to keep in mind when pulling buoyant risers. For one thing, a person should monitor the picture from the remotely operated video, ROV camera, while the risers are being pulled. If the ROV spots a cracked module, or a module that appears as though it could fall off the riser joint, the person should notify the floor crew to be on the lookout for it. As the joint comes through the rig floor, the crew can secure the module to the riser and prevent its falling off. The greatest danger occurs when the riser is at about a 45-degree angle from vertical as the crew lowers it out of the derrick. It's at this point where the stresses on the modules are highest. Thus, a cracked module can break worn or improperly secured straps, or it can snap corroded hardware. The module then falls to the floor, where it can hurt or kill someone. Handling buoyant riser joints is not difficult, but to do it right, always take the time needed to properly store, handle, attach, run,